Welcome to Not Going Quietly, the podcast where we inspire growth, beat down biases, and get into all sorts of good trouble, with co-hosts Jonathan Beal and Britt East.
No topic is off limits as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy.
So get ready to join us for some courageous conversation, because Not Going Quietly starts right now.
Hey everyone, welcome to Not Going Quietly, the podcast for outraged optimists and heartbroken healers all over the world, where we talk about the things everybody's dying to listen to but maybe too afraid to bring up themselves. My name is Britt East, and I'm here with my amazing co-host, Jonathan Beal. How the hell are you today, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm good. I was saying to you earlier, I've been ill for a while. And so to come out of the other side and be sat here being clear-minded and able to actually have a real conversation feels really good. So that's my British answer.
There you go.
My American answer is perfect and improving.
There you go. Thank you for reminding everybody. Thank you for so, Monica, Jonathan, I joke around all the time that in the U.S., when somebody asks how you're doing, you just say good, or you say something super optimistic and phony, like perfect and improving. So I've been trying to train Jonathan on to get rid of all of his British reality and be a little less authentic. Well, I'm so happy and excited to welcome back our featured guest today, Dr. Monica Rojas-Stewart. We had such a great time chatting with her and her husband, Rojas-Stewart, on a previous episode, and I really hope all of you go and check that out. We got to chat with them about Wairuro, the organization they co-founded to help you to utilize peacekeeping circles as a social technology to bring people together. We learned all about that process and that organization. And today we're going to dive in deeper with Monica and her other projects and talk some about the diaspora experience and intercultural fluency and how to use dance and art as an embodied form to bolster those social connections. So I think it's going to be a really great conversation. Dr. Monica Rojas-Stewart originally hails from Lima, Peru, and holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Washington. Her areas of expertise focus on Afro-Latinx communities in Latin America, the Spanish Caribbean, their diasporas, and their performance traditions as transborder technologies of resilience and community building. As a community artist and activist, Rojas-Stewart devoted the last 15 years to extensive community-based organizing and artistic work as a pioneer performer and educator of Afro-Peruvian culture and of the Afro-Latinx arts movement in the Pacific Northwest. She is the co-founder of De Cajon Project and Movimiento Afro-Latino Seattle, MAS, M-A-S, two grassroots arts organizations dedicated to educating about the history and cultural contributions of people of African descent in Peru and Latin America, respectively. Rojas-Stewart is co-founder of Wairuro, LLC, and she is currently the Assistant Director of the African Studies and the Latin American and Caribbean Studies programs at the Jackson School of International Studies, as well as part-time lecturer in the Department of Dance at the University of Washington. Dr. Monica Rojas-Stewart, welcome to the show. We are so excited that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me back, and I feel special because this time is all about me and talking with you guys and talking about my projects and my mission in life. So I'm really excited and very grateful for the space. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica. Why don't you start by telling us some about your music, your dance career and education? What are your favorite musics and forms of dance? How has your journey been as an immigrant and moving to the U.S. and getting your PhD at the University of Washington? Tell us some about your story.
Let's see. It's a long journey. It's been a long time since I arrived here in the Pacific Northwest, but I guess something that has really shaped my academic studies and my activism here in Seattle is that when I finished high school back in Peru, I really wanted to go in deeply into the arts, in theater, in music and dance, and so I got deeply involved in the Afro-Peruvian community through dance. I was 15 years old. And I saw this particular dance being performed And that moment was magical to me. I was at a recital. A friend of mine from my neighborhood was doing a dance for a recital for her dance school, and I went just to support her. And then I saw this one dance done by other people that really impacted me. And I said, I want to learn how to dance that dance. And that was the portal. That moment was the portal for me to not only learn how to dance that dance. It's called marinera, but also that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to understand the why, who, when, how, and then to discover that this particular dance had a strong influence from the African descent population in Peru, which led me to the history of the African descent people in Peru and the history of slavery and colonialism. And by getting involved with this community, I started to see, inequities and racism and discrimination in my society. So then that brought new questions about why, how, when, and I became involved with a movement that was founded back then. I'm talking late 80s. And it was a group of young Black Afro-Peruvian intellectuals got together and formed a movement called Movimiento Negro Francisco Congo. And I got involved with them, and I was part of a dance revival. There was a devil's dance that has its own history, which is fascinating. There's devil's dances in many parts of the Spanish colonies, right? In the Americas, in Latin America, and the Caribbean. So this particular dance in Peru had been kind of disappeared from the streets. It was transferred to the stage, but it disappeared from the streets in the 1950s due to prohibition of carnival celebrations in Peru. So then I was part of this revival of this dance, which brought even more information about, the presence of the why devil's dance is practiced by Afro-Peruvians, right? And then I learned about the imposition of this dance during colonial times. So I was without knowing, in my teenage years, I was already kind of doing ethnomusicology and anthropology. And so I'm telling this because when I came to study, I had already this big background in music and dance, and also history, and being involved in the community and activism, because many people get into college to think, what is going to be my project? What am I going to do? I'm interested in this, but I'm not sure, right? I came already with a lived experience. So it was very clear. The path for me was very clear. The reasons how or why I ended up in the Pacific Northwest is a topic for another interview, right? But I ended up in Oregon. I arrived in Oregon and got a scholarship for international students at Oregon State University. And when I got to the Pacific Northwest, I ended up coming also to the UW as a visiting scholar first, and then I got a scholarship to study. And it was, to me, what was fascinating was to realize that people didn't know that there were Black people in Peru. First, Black people in Peru. So when I came as a visiting scholar, I came specifically to give lectures on Afro-Peruvian culture and music and dance. So I brought my musical instruments and costumes and, talked about my experience there. And it was just incredible to realize that, people didn't know about the presence of Black people in Peru, and then consequently in other parts of Latin America, right? Peru, like Bolivia and Ecuador, and that region is perceived as the Andean region because of the Andes, of course. And then, so there's a strong imagination of indigenous populations, but not necessarily the history of African descent people. So I had already been involved in Peru doing this work, visibilizing the history and fighting discrimination around this population. So I felt like my mission had to continue here to visibilizing these communities. So I did my undergraduate in Oregon, and then I came to Seattle to do my master's and PhD in 2000. And when I arrived here, with my already undergraduate background, I had written an interesting paper for my undergraduate degree. And so my mission just continued here. But when I arrived here in taking classes more focused on the African diaspora in Latin America, which is my area of expertise, I also wanted, since I'm an artist, since I'm a dancer, I'm a musician, I wanted to continue that and continue feeding that, and found as an opportunity for me to get involved with other Afro-Latino groups here, or Afro-Latino leaders, or people who were also practicing or doing things related to the African diaspora in Latin America. And that's how I got involved first with Grupo Baiano, which is led by Sharon Cronin. It's an incredible woman activist also in the community that founded this group that were doing Afro-Puerto Rican, Afro-Cuban dance. And with them, I met other people, and then I got involved with Todo Folklore Cubano, and met then Mestre Silvinho, who does from Brazil, who does Capoeira Angola, and this chain of different artists and leaders here in the community who are practicing or teaching, African diaspora artistic forms. And so I got involved in that while also doing my studies to complement my studies at the university. And at this point, I forgot the question.
No. Okay. That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. You've had such a rich journey. It's just fascinating. I have this theory. I don't want to speak for Jonathan, but I think this is one we kind of share, and I'm interested in your take, Monica, is that the art that you're describing is beautiful and important for its own sake. And I think when we talk about fractures in our social, our community, whether that's the US or the UK where Jonathan lives, I think part of the time we get hung up in all of our kind of cognitive theory. Like we have these deal breakers in our head. Like if you think this, then I have to cancel you. Or if you say that, then I can't be your friend. Or where are you on this issue? And that heady work can be really important in some facets of our lives, but it also has to be augmented, complemented by the one-to-one connections. And here's the theory, is that best happens in embodied ways, through sharing stories, through music, and through dance, which I'm not a dancer. I have a background in music, but I have this affinity for dance, and I can't help but wonder, and I would love to hear your experiences as a dancer and an artist and creator. It's like, it just seems like there's something so powerful in setting down the language and the knowledge and moving our bodies and sweating together, especially when that art emanates from our folkloric traditions, our mythologies, and our shared stories.
That's a big question. It's a very big question, and I can speak of what it is like for Afro-Latino dance specifically, and also when I teach at the University of Washington, it's been fascinating to introduce these art forms to these students who come from different backgrounds, ballet, modern dance, and something that I hear over and over and over about the power of Afro-Latinx dance is that the meaning behind is not about being physically fit or looking certain way, and it's not as individualistic and competitive as these other art forms, because the history behind these art forms really is resistance and resilience. These communities, I'm going to talk about that specifically Afro-Latinx dance, because that's my area of expertise particularly, right? But imagine that there are similar stories for other minoritized communities. These dances have a history of figuring out how to continue being, how to continue performing or being human, despite the fact of your experiencing the worst conditions ever, right? Imagine these communities were brought from Africa, forcibly in terrible conditions, brought to a completely new continent where they were not able to bring their drums, they were not able to bring anything. They were forced to forget, their language. They forced to embrace a different religion, a different spirituality, and all these things, clothing and culture and structures and everything. They had to figure out how to continue being human and with dignity, right? And there's a very powerful saying from Victoria Santa Cruz. They can, and other people, I've heard these from other people, you can slave the body, but you cannot enslave the mind, right? So memory has been a very powerful tool in the African diaspora to be able to continue holding on to whatever they could in order to continue practice. So dance is been a powerful platform for them to express that, and it has taken shape differently in different parts of that diaspora, right? And but the purpose at the end is always this a way for people to be together, to connect, to survive culturally, and remember together, how to be, how to dance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you have all these different Afro-Latino dance forms that are practiced in Peru, which look very differently from bomba in Puerto Rico, for example. The Caribbean is very special because it's if you look at the map, the Caribbean is in a very strategic area, very close to Africa, which was like a how do you say, like a port or place where people stop and then distributed, that enslaved people to different regions. So there was a lot of traffic, and more information could travel through the Caribbean. So you see skin drums, you see the Orisha religion very alive there, which comes from the Yoruba people from West Africa, etc. But if you think for a minute where Peru is located on the west side of South America. On the other side of the Andes, completely isolated, right? So in the case of Peru, the African descent people were completely isolated and didn't have that information travel as easy, right? So they had to go through a process of kind of memory and ancestral memory, right? Ancestral memory to continue practicing some songs and practicing rhythms, and in many of the inspiration that fed that what we know today as Afro-Peruvian music comes from many times from Brazil, from the Atlantic, for the Atlantic coast, because it's the closest to Africa. So it's very important to understand that the resilience of these people for hundreds of years to be able to continue to practice their music. So when we talk about embodying that, you have to understand that history. You have to understand where all these dances came from. So when in addition to the fact that part of the colonial project was to divide people from West Africa, or people who were brought from Africa, were brought from different language communities, different areas, so they couldn't communicate. So, and they were mixed, right? So they couldn't communicate because communication is dangerous. So the drum dance became the source of communication and a common language, let's say, right? So in Seattle, when I started the Movimiento Afro-Latino Seattle, part of my, which again I had connected with these communities during my studies, and while doing my academic studies, and while I was dancing in these groups that I mentioned and connecting with all of these different local artists doing Afro-Latinx dances from different regions, Brazil and Panama and Puerto Rico and Cuba, etc. There were some common things that I started noticing in terms of the shape of a drum or a rhythmic pattern or step dance, right? Sequences or things like that, or lyrics also in Spanish. It's fascinating finding lyrics in Peru that are present in son jarocho in Mexico, and also in Panama with Puerto Rico. So then I said, we need to come together because the history, the African descent people have been denied their own history on purpose. They've been blocked and said, your history begins with slavery in this new continent. It's not true, right? So there's a shared history of colonialism. There are elements that are part of this ancestral memory in the African diaspora that is important to connect, to understand, to also understand our commonalities and also our own different experiences in the different regions. So there's so much that can be said about the power of this collective dancing and collective being together and playing music, because this is when the Movimiento for Latino Seattle started. We had no idea that we were going to have the response that we did. We had community forums to figure out what would people like to see in an Afro-Latino arts education season. We kind of wanted to sense what people knew about Afro-Latinos, if people knew about African descent Latinos. And we had a huge response from the community, and that's what pushed us to start this nonprofit organization, con más Movimiento for Latino Seattle. But the power of that movement was that people, that Afro Venezuelans and Garifuna people from Central America, from Honduras, and the Son Jarocho and the Panameñas and Puerto Ricans, they started feeling like they were looking at each other in the mirror, like, wow, you call it that way, I call it this way, and I move this way, and you move this way. This is common. And it's been kind of a process of decolonizing, because again, colonization divided on purpose, divided these communities. And what we started was a process of decolonization through dance, like bringing people together and learn and kind of uniting the diaspora again. So that's to me is the most powerful aspect of the work that we've been done around music and dance. And again, teaching this at the University of Washington has been incredible, because the students have been able to understand dance beyond the movement, the aesthetic of it. Dance is history, dance is ancestrality, dance is power, is resilience, is resistance, dance is organizing, is community building. So I hope I answered the question. Again, I get so passionate about this, and I just keep talking. So
it's great. I like to really kind of pick up on that resilience and resistance aspect. Like it strikes me how many forces were at play trying to erase essentially culture and connection and community, and to find this avenue to really support people in coming back together and like you say, decolonize. Like I just think it's incredible, and it's wonderful to see that even through that the roots can be found, and that I don't know if I'm explaining myself right, but
no, you are.
Yeah, I am. I'm so pleased that it has survived, and that through this route that it gets to thrive again and bring people back together, right? And not only that, but expose the colonized world, the colonizers, to this culture as well at the same time, right? I hope that makes sense.
Yes, no, definitely. The root is there, the connections are there. The tricky part is organizing people to walk them through the path that will help them understand that, because some people are not there. Some people want to ignore their blackness, because we've been told that black is bad, and black is, in Latin America, we suffer of racism with ourselves. Like, we deny that part. We want to be European. We want to highlight, our European background, and we are not indigenous, we're not African, or maybe some indigenous, some here, some there, and that's where the word Te'ingi Mandinga comes from that I'll explain later. The title of this production that I've put on multiple years. So we are all mixed in Latin America. We're all mixed, but there's a lot of denial too. So yes, the root is there. There's possibilities. There's a way to reconnect and unpack this history. But you also need to meet people where they are, right? And some people are not there yet. So it's been a very interesting path to put on this movement, and through this movement, see people finding a platform where finally they can say, "Oh, there's a space for me to be Black and Latino," because that's another thing, you know. African descent Latinos here feel like because of the way they look are assumed to be Black Americans. But there's a very difference. There's a big difference culturally, not only language, but you know the history in this country is different from different regions in Latin America and so on and so forth. So, but they don't fit there. But also they don't fit in the stereotype of that what a Latino is. So because of racism, anti-Blackness in Latin America, in the Latinx communities, you know, Latinos, you know, deny also that you're Black, there's racism. So this group, this population is kind of in the middle of in this confusion about who am I and what's my history. So I think I went somewhere else from your comment.
No. You know, I was thinking of the technical aspect too when you were talking, like when you are teaching the dance, the choreography of a particular dance, is part of it also the cultural transmission and storytelling? And maybe you can use that answer to kind of start to segue us into Dinga and Mandinga.
Again, when I'm teaching, for example, when I teach at the University of Washington, many of these students, again, they have no idea about the presence of people of African descent in Peru or other parts of Latin America because they don't teach that in schools. So definitely, when they're learning the dance steps that I'm teaching, they understand that there was a process of erasure and a process of using ancestral memory to revive and kind of rescue these dances and continue practicing them. So there's a, right, we're talking about Peru. I was explaining how in Peru things kind of broke and there had to be a revival of this tradition, especially in the 1960s. So definitely I have to talk about history. I have for them to be able to practice the step dance and the movements, the meaning of the movements, where they come from and why, right? Definitely. I call them babies. I have many babies since in my journey here in the Pacific Northwest. One was the cajon project when I used the cajon drum as a pretext to start teaching classes and tell about history of African descent Peruvians. So that's one project I launched in 2009 and formed a company, music and dance company with whom we've performed throughout the Pacific Northwest. Then there's MAS, Movimiento Afro-Latino Seattle, where I decided to expand my activism here in the Pacific Northwest and brought together, along with other artists, the African diaspora and the migrant communities here to educate the community, kind of to activate these communities and educate about the presence and cultural contributions of people of African descent, not only Peru, but other parts of Latin America. And my third baby is the Ingi Mandinga, which is a more, it's also a kind of movement, but it's more from the artistic point of view. In 2011, I brought an Afro-Peruvian artist called Miguel Bayumbrosio, and he comes from a Black community south of Lima. If you were in Lima and you drove south 2 hours and then east 20 minutes, you get to a small town that was originally a palenque. A palenque is the place where runaway slaves hid. And so it was originally a palenque, that town, and it developed into a village, right? And So there's a strong Black community in that area of Peru, and they have a particular dance called Atajo de Negritos, which is like Christmas caroling, but dancing, stomping, using a bell, and it's very indigenous. The melody, the violin, and it's very African rhythmically, and the stomping, and it's very Spanish because of the way that the dance is structured, and the lyrics are in Spanish, right? So there's this particular tradition. So in 2011, I brought Miguel Vallambrosio to introduce the Atajo de Negritos to the community here as part of the Cajon project. And while he was here, I decided, maybe why don't we put on a show that talks about the history of this particular dance and why, people don't know much about Afro-Peruvians. And so that's when we talked about saying, okay, let's put on a concert, a theater production that talks about the history of colonialism. So what I did is I created a list of standards from the Afro-Peruvian tradition, because I wanted it to be from the perspective of Black Peruvians telling this history of colonialism, because that's another aspect, right? We always hear about the story from the colonizer's mind about slavery. At least historically, if you look at texts from colonial times, the voices that we hear that tell the story is from the perspective of the colonizer. So what about Afro-Peruvians telling about colonialism from their perspective, from their music repertoire? So the Inga Mandinga emerged from that. The Inga Mandinga is a phrase, actually it's a short for a longer sentence that says, El que no tiene de Inga, tiene de Mandinga, which talks about the mixture of blood. I was explaining how some people deny sometimes they're African roots or indigenous roots, and in Peru, this is a phrase that was coined in the 1800s to say, "Oh, come on! If you're mixed, you either have Black or indigenous blood, right?" That's where the Inga is a Castellanization of the word Inca, so indigenous, and Mandinga is a reference to West African people. So the Inga y Mandinga. So I have mixed blood. That's what this phrase means. So I said, let's talk about this mixture of cultures and let's put on this show. So in 2012 was the first concert at the Langston Hughes Performing Arts Theater. We put a beautiful concert with the Cajon Project Company and Miguel Vallambrosio from Peru to talk about the history of colonialism, ending with the Atajo de Negritos, which is a perfect tradition that, again, mixes all the encounter of indigenous, African, and Spanish blood. And it was a huge success. And I incorporated children because mentoring is important, and also kids need to find their roots being away from Peru. And many of the kids who participated in the show are Peruvian descent, first generation, second generation, who found in the creative process of the Inga Mandinga and their participation in playing Cajon and being part of this production, found a connection, finally found like, okay, this is where I come from, this is mine, this is right, and they performed, and it was just a very powerful production, intergenerational, bilingual, combined music repertoire and dance, and also we projected the lyrics translation. It had poetry, narration, and it was such a success that the leadership of Langston Hughes said, this needs to be a holiday performance for every year. We need to bring this back in the following year. So the following year we put it on again, and this is 2013. So my mind was already into mass, right? Into connecting Afro-Latinx communities. So in the Inga Mandinga 2014 was the first time I pushed a little bit my artistic vision and incorporated, it wasn't not only about Peru anymore. I incorporated Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, and along with Peru. So I brought artists from Peru, and then we collaborated with local Colombian, Venezuelan, Argentinian artists, Panamanian, and put on the Inga Mandinga version that talked about this little girl looking for her identity and travels from country to country with this music, these songs that were standard of the repertoire of these different countries to tell the story. And we had a map projected that showed a hand drawing, the map of Colombia, and then a line to Venezuela, and then from Venezuela traveled to Argentina. So it was also multimedia, multi-generational again, and to tell the story. So the Ingi Mandinga, it's been my artistic way. So Mas and the Cajon have been more hands-on community organizing. The Ingi Mandinga has been more like an artistic platform for people to come to the theater and watch this theater production and learn about the history of colonialism. So 2014 was the last time I put that production on, because it's a lot of work and it's a year-long full-time kind of endeavor, because it involves 20-something artists coordinating rehearsals and deciding on repertoire, etc. Until I met Gus Denhart, the executive director of Early Music Seattle. I met him in 2018, and in our sharing and collaborations, I brought up that I had put on this show, but I didn't have the capacity to do this anymore. And that's when he said, well, how can Early Music Seattle help you bring this back? Because this is needed. And so here we are. We started planning a new version of the Ingi Mandinga. It's been a while. It's been several years. So artistically, I've also, I think I've developed, I've grown. So new ideas emerge. And in the Cajon project, we have a couple of Jewish musicians, singers who have been part of the Cajon project and the Ingi Mandinga, and we've never really catered to their communities or included them in the music process. And then in that conversation, we realized that there's a whole history of Jewish culture in Latin America and migration, from the Iberic Peninsula since 1400. So we said, what about incorporating Ladino music and Sephardic music into the story of the Ingi Mandinga, because there's also been that cultural mixture. So this new version of the Ingi Mandinga that we've been working on, it incorporates Afro-diasporic music with Sephardic Ladino music. But then COVID came, and we've been trying to put this show in 2021, and then we were going to put it on in 2022, but it was really challenging for us to rehearse, and because a big aspect of the Ingi Mandinga in my work, in my artistic vision, is the process. More than the end product, process is really important. The creative process where everybody has a voice in decision making and the repertoire, and relationship building, in exploring our own histories of ancestrality, in putting on this show, because we're talking about the encounter of this culture. So process in putting the Ingi Mandinga together is really, really important. Not so much the end product, if that makes sense. So I want to be mindful of that, and I don't want to rush and take our time to really continue building together as opposed to putting on a concert. So that's why we want to take our time, just like the circle process, trust the process, let's slow down, let's build meaningful relationships to hear all the voices in the creative process of the Ingi Mandinga. So right now we paused, and we hope to put it on sometime in the next few months, maybe early next year. So that's where we are.
It sounds like such incredibly powerful and important work. And sorry, Britt, if I spoke over you then. I think I might have heard you, so I apologize for that. And it really, there's something about it, and especially with the circle work and all of that kind of democratizes and brings a way for people to truly connect and truly see each other, and to almost, to Britt's point, it's like an embodied connection, relation, and way to connect and be reminded of our common humanness.
Exactly.
And really, you know, there's no better medium than dance and music and share and using that as a platform to share our culture, our history, and our I'm kind of going off. I do these tangents too, Monica. So you know. And I think the question there is a question in there, and that is like because it sounds incredibly healing to me in many ways, and I kind of wonder the impact from that perspective in terms of what you've seen or the conversations that you've had surrounding it. Like, what has the impact been from a healing perspective?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. And something I regret all these years is not having journal. I should have been journaling, because I've had so many reach out to me, telling me that an event changed their life. You know, a dialogue, community dialogue that we had about Afro-Latinx identity, what that means, has been healing to them. So many people have gone back to their parents, back to grandparents, to find, I know I'm African descent. Why has this story been denied to me? Where, I know auntie blah, 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 is African. I've had endless stories like that. But one particular example is the current director of the Movimiento for Latino Seattle. Her name is Milvia Pacheco, and she's an Afro-Venezuelan woman. And when she was in Seattle, she's a modern dancer. She's been dancing modern dance since her teenage years, and has toured and lived in Argentina, went to New York as a modern dancer, and she's expressed how one of the reasons why she was doing modern dance is because it was the whitest thing she could do, right? She denying her blackness in trying to deny, her blackness. And when she got to Seattle, she became a mom. She had a baby, and she says how she was in some way lost because she didn't have a clear path. And then when she found MAS, the Movimiento for Latino Seattle, that became the path for her to heal. And heal and find herself and identify herself as Black and start unpacking all that racism that she had towards herself. And her path for healing began with this movement, in finding community, in finding a platform that spoke of her identity with dignity, empowering her and others, and so that's probably the biggest example. And now she's become the executive director of the Movimiento for Latino Seattle, and she's doing amazing work. Not only healing in her own path, which continues, but also in bringing other people and connecting with other people, and reconnecting with Venezuela, which she hasn't gone back to. But now, she's reconnecting to now the traditions that she remembers, growing up. And there's stories like that, so many stories. So thank you for that question. That's and my UW students who are not necessarily Afro-Latinx, they've mentioned how they now are seeing dance. They are understanding dance in a completely different way. Now they want to understand more, about their privilege, and which is also part of healing. We all need to heal, right? Not only Afro-Latino, but everybody needs to heal from this history that we all have been part of. So definitely healing has been and I have so many examples in the process of the Ingi Mandinga as well. I'm telling you about the kids who have been coming, mothers. There's a mother particularly who told me, that the Ingi Mandinga gave their kids rootedness and pride, because in schools they're bullied or they're ignored or because of the way they look. But this gave them, these kids, kind of like clarity of who they are, why they look different, who they are, what their roots are, and having something to hold on to. So there's been healing across, populations and age. And yeah, it's a very powerful work. Very, very powerful work. Thank you again for that question.
A pleasure. Yeah.
I was struck with your story about how we all stand at the intersections of multiple identities and are complex mixtures of privilege and adversity. And that's really why we started this podcast, to surface those issues that we don't have time, capacity, or desire to discuss, like race, like our true complex, rich tapestry of stories and histories. And then to find ways to come together. The podcast is really heady because it's a podcast, and so that's one medium. But what I'm so captivated by in your story and your journey is the immense value that you're providing for our global community when you think about the ripple effects, because you are, at least inadvertently, maybe on purpose, preempting a lot of issues we discussed in our previous episode with you, where some people might feel intimidated by conversations on race. Some people might feel it's too depressing to talk about gender inequality. Some people might say, well, it was so long ago. Why does this apply to my life today? I'm busy. I'm tired. I'm trying to put food on the table. But what you're doing is like this celebratory artistic expression that carries with it, that is born of the true stories that have been passed down throughout the years. So it carries all of that education with it intrinsically. And so, we have this theory like the world would be a better place if there were more public singing and dancing, because we kind of come together rather than staying stuck in like this theorizing and focusing on our differences. We come together, and our, archaeologists know they found humans when they find art. And so we tap into those really deep-seated parts of our human design, and it's just fun. Like you described, it's not maybe the classical art music experience where you go and you sit in silence and attention, you look at the stage, you have this kind of art presented at you. It's more interactive. You talked about singing and dancing and getting up and moving together. And I'm just struck by the immense value in that, and the beauty of the healing stories that you were sharing from multiple dimensions, the artists themselves, but also the audience members, whether they're seeing themselves for the first time or they're starting to develop curiosity and empathy for people that come from different walks of life. It just seems like a really beautiful healing experience. And I'd like to hear some, and you alluded this to a minute ago, how it has changed your life personally, and maybe the way that you view your cultural identity.
You said a lot there, Britt, that is very relevant. The first thing is the joy. Absolutely. Joy is something that has been part of the resistance of these communities, right? The joy. And having everybody experience that together, the collective participatory aspect of the arts, I think is really important, as opposed to the passive absorption consuming art from a passive perspective, where I go, I pay my ticket, I sit down, and I which the Inge Mandinga has that, but I would say in a different way. But the Afro-Latinx and MAS and the Cajon has looked for more opportunities for the collective kind of participatory joy, where everybody's welcome, because again, everybody needs to heal and everybody needs to participate in this healing process.
Yeah, how has it impacted your own life, and maybe even changed or enriched, like witnessing all this healing and joy being transmitted and people participating and experiencing it? How has it enriched your own life and maybe your understanding of where you fit into the cultural tapestry? That is what keeps me
going. Because community work is hard. It's really hard. It's many times it's not sustainable, right? There's I've been dedicated to this work for so many years, and it's not necessarily, I wish I could devote myself to doing this work, but unfortunately it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable financially, but it's been sustainable for me in many ways. It keeps me going, doing the work that needs to be done. But you know, specifically to answer your question more directly about me, myself, this is what has given meaning to me being away from Peru. When I launched the Cajon project in 2009, it emerged because my realization that I wasn't going back to Peru. I came as an international student. I had my international passport, and I had, you know, my visa to study, and my plan was to go back. But then I got married, I had children, you know, the system just swept me, you know, and I became a citizen. We bought a house, and one day I woke up and realized that I wasn't going back, and I had to figure out how am I gonna continue doing the work that I was doing back in Peru. You know, I told a story about me being so involved in the Afro-Peruvian community as an artist, but also as an activist, but now I was here in the Pacific Northwest. So this has been part of my own personal healing. Absolutely. You know, it gave meaning for me to be away from home. It became, it kind of shaped my mission of being so far away. So the Cajon project, and then Movimiento Afro Latino. Now when I teach at the University of Washington, and now these students at the University of Washington, but also in the community, I'm teaching Cajon right now, percussion. And I had so many people come and so many people show up. And every time I'm in a situation like that where people come to learn from me, or I have the opportunity to share what I know, it every single time it gives meaning for me being away from home, because I miss being in Peru. An ethnomusicologist I worked with in Peru told me, you know, Monica, go study, get your degree, but come back because we need you here. We need you here. Please come back. But life, you know, did what it did, as I explained. So I live with that feeling. So how am I gonna continue working for the Afro-Peruvian community and the people that I you know shared so much with me? How am I gonna make that you know, good for me to be away? So this has given meaning to me. So that's what gives meaning for me being in Seattle, being in the Pacific Northwest, and also is the force, the energy that makes me keep going again and again and again and again, doing this community work.
That's so beautiful and such a poignant story. I had the privilege to sit down and interview the leader of a dance company in Minneapolis, who is an Indian American, and she and her daughter formed the dance company, and have been around for decades and extremely successful, and continuing a lineage from Southeast India, and you know they've. Your story kind of reminds me of that in terms of that poignant, celebratory, but also sad and beautiful story of diaspora. And what they mentioned, and I'm curious if this resonates for you, Monica, is they talked about, you know, the art form in India keeps advancing and progressing is not the right word with art, but keeps changing and evolving and deepening and growing, as does their art form in Minneapolis. And so it gets further and further apart, and then they try to find ways to kind of come together, and it becomes this beautiful dance in a way. But there's a poignancy there too, a sadness and a beauty that it's not what it was exactly in the country of their birth, but in this new country, it's something different and also extremely beautiful and powerful and meaningful. But it is different. Does that feel true for you? Does that resonate with what your journey has been?
This is a very interesting question. This is a very interesting question. I think of different ways, different layers, because many people, for example, in the case of Peru, many people who migrate and has been in the U.S., Peruvians, I mean, for many, many, many years, they have a memory of what traditional dance and music is. While in Peru, things have evolved and changed. things, because culture always evolves in response to different situations. So there's people in Peru who are pushing and challenging, the ways things were practiced back in the 60s, and there's a very complex history of how, when these traditions were staged, black traditions were staged in the 60s and 70s, it had a narrative of slavery in it, because Afro-Peruvians were interested in telling the history, in visibilizing the history of colonialism, right? But then when with commercialization, things are problematic that way, because people are consuming this narrative of a colonial identity. So there are people in Peru who are pushing that emerging, and things are changing. But Peruvians who have migrated to the U.S. and other parts of the country, they still remember that how Afro-Peruvian music and dance was practiced back then. So they have their perception of tradition. So to answer your question, there's the people who continue practicing things the way they were practiced back then, and they have changed at the local level in Peru. But then there's other people who are trying new things. And I think that's been part of the Cajon project. I've tried to, being aware of this, and also as an anthropologist, and being connected with those communities, despite the fact that I'm physically removed or away, I've been attentive of the evolution and the things that have occurred, because also it's my area of studies. So I've tried to parallel the efforts in Peru to kind of challenge that problematic identity and propose new things that many people, even within Peru, don't perceive as traditional. So I've been doing the same thing here, kind of responding and walking along with those who are proposing new things, new costumes, new narrative, new Black identity projected on stage, let's say, right? But at the same time, I cannot deny that I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and there's a Jewish person in the group, right? And there's people in the Cajon project who are not Peruvian. And my husband, Jabali, he's Black American, but also Black Caribbean, so he has the Trinidadian component in him. So we've incorporated in the Cajon, playing Afro-Peruvian music, music from influences from there, and then he's also a punk rock musician. So we've incorporated in the Ingi Mandinga is the rock, and we've put also, and now we're exploring, Ladino and Sephardic music. So of course that in the eyes of Peruvians who are in Peru are going to say, well, the Ingi Mandinga is not so much Peruvian anymore, right? So yes, so there's people who continue practicing things the way they were before this whole evolution, and then there's other people who are also pushing boundaries and trying new things and experimenting based on their new reality, which is my case. So that was a very interesting question. Yeah, because I know Peruvians who are trying to stick to the very, very hardcore, what they perceive as traditional, what it should be, how it should be, when in Peru is not like that anymore. It is not. I'm talking about Peru because I'm Peruvian. I don't want to talk about our cultures, but I know that's the case for Cuba, and in that Cuba, people in Africa are going to Cuba to learn how things used to be in Africa, in West Africa, because in Cuba things have been preserved that are evolving in Africa, in West Africa. So that transnational dynamic and is fascinating. So very good question. You guys are amazing. Very good questions.
Oh, you're too kind. You're too kind. It has been such a pleasure to talk to you today. What a beautiful conversation. And I don't know about Jonathan. You can chime in here, Jonathan, but you have filled me, Monica, with so much hope.
Yes.
There's so much darkness in the world, always. And and you alluded to this earlier, Monica, too. This work is depleting. And I'm kind of maybe a natural pessimist. And so it really, I can go dark quickly and I can kind of dwell in the darkness, which doesn't help anybody. But the work that you're doing, the art that you're creating fills me with so much hope and joy and reminds me that this can be celebratory. Like you said, the joy is an act of resistance in and of itself, intrinsically, because that was part of what was trying to be stolen. And to lead to subservience and slavery. And so I had never thought of that before. That was a huge aha moment for me in our conversation today. So, Jonathan, I don't know if that resonates with you, but I just feel so
100%.
Uplifted after our chat.
There's a certain amount of pessimism that comes, right? When we look at our history, like when I look at my history as a home of colonialism, like there's a level of pessimism, disappointment, frustration, anger that comes with it. And so to have this essential ray of light that is essentially, look, it wasn't lost. Like it wasn't lost. Like there's a way for us to experience this now, and for people to understand their pasts and their history and where their culture comes from, and to connect on that level and learn from each other and find community in the process and healing. Like, that it fills you with hope.
Yes, reflecting on history, unpacking this history. There doesn't have to be angry, right?
Yeah.
Anger definitely has its place, and that's one path. That's one path.
Yes.
But there's this. I'm proposing a different path that also has its place. I think there's different ways to heal. It's all about healing. So the arts, I think, is a very, very powerful tool for social change. I truly believe that. And different people approach that work in different ways, and joy, I think, is something that we all need, especially after these years and where we are right now and everything that's going on. I want to nurture joy, and art can bring joy and healing, definitely.
Absolutely. I absolutely love that. And thank you again for your time today and for sharing all of your knowledge and your journey and your history, your stories with us and your art. We're going to include links to all of these projects in the show notes so people can learn more about you personally, professionally, and if they're local, can get involved in the art and maybe find some of your work online. We'll include all of that in the show notes. So listeners, please make sure you check that out. Again, we've been talking with Dr. Monica Rojas-Stewart, who is just an absolute hero in this work, and we're so thrilled to have her on the podcast today. We encourage you to tune in, to other episodes, because we do these kinds of conversations, every episode. That's what our podcast is about, is focusing on these connections and points of healing. So please check out other episodes on our website and wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. We're there. So on that note, you've been listening to Not Going Quietly. I'm your host, Britt East, with my amazing co-host, Jonathan Beal. Thank you so much for your time today, and stay tuned for our next episode. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Not Going Quietly with co-hosts Jonathan Beal and Britt East.
Thanks so much for joining us on this wild ride as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy.
Check out our show notes for links, additional information, and episodes located on your favorite podcast platform.